Recently, I've been making some guides on Strategic Command, World War II, World at War. I've covered the beginner's basics as well as all things war, and we're going to start diving into some more micro topics, such as research. Let's talk about research today and what every single research is, and then I might give you some tips on maybe prioritization based on nation, for example. So to get started, research is an overtime activity that you invest MPPs, which is this game's version of like money and resources, into. Every nation has a different amount of MPPs that can be actively invested at one time. It's listed right down here for every different nation that you can select. For Germany, it's 2,000, Japan, 2,000, Italy, 1,200, much lower. You could see your total amount already invested right here under total research funding, and then available is just a reflection of your total MPPs, which are also up here at the top left. When looking at each research category, we have a lot of numbers here. Let's go ahead and explain these numbers. So let's start from the right side here, where you'll see these two numbers, one not in parentheses and one in parentheses. The number that is not in parentheses here is the amount of levels of this tech you already have researched. The number within the parentheses is the total amount that you can have researched. So for infantry weapons, we're at level 1 out of 2. For anti-tank, we're at 0 out of 5. And there's a description at the bottom when I hover over any of these that kind of gives you a brief summary of what each level will do and what it will grant you, but it's not the most in-depth. As you see, this is a green bar. This is not a green bar. If research has a green bar, it is being researched, unlike not having a green bar, which is not being researched. There's also more information here, such as this number. This is the amount of MPPs it would take to assign one research chit. You could see how many research chits you have assigned right here. You only need one research chit, which costs this amount of money, to get research going. Additional research chits will queue up additional research beyond the level you are researching, as well as speed up that current tier of research. However, it does get invested and you have to worry about these caps and what else could you be spending those MPPs on anyway. Research is not just researched and sped up by the amount of chits assigned and where you are and whatnot, but your allied nations, whether you are the Axis or the Allies, will actually contribute research to each other, but it's not like everybody will. For example, Germany and Italy will generally be expected to share with each other, but Japan, well, you'll find Japan is actually pretty uncooperative. Same thing with the Soviet Union. Some nations don't share with anybody and they don't receive with anybody. A really good microcosm example of this is America shares tech with China, but China doesn't share tech with America. This means that if America has infantry weapons level 2 and China has anything underneath that, then infantry weapons research in China will actually be sped up thanks to the assistance of America. However, if China had level 2 and America did not, then America would not benefit from China having a higher level. There is absolutely no way to check this information in game, but it is in the manual, which you could pull up over here or in your actual game files. This up button is how you assign a chit of research. We can't afford any right now. And the down button would be to reclaim a chit. You get 50% of the money back for it. There's some strategies early on with reclaiming chits from certain nations, but it's really up to you if you deem assigning and reclaiming chits worth it. Usually I don't, but that is how it works. Now, let's go over a little bit more information we can see here before we start talking about the actual research. So In this table, you can get like a brief glimpse of every nation on your side's research. Makes more sense for the allies because they have like 7 majors instead of 3. And then additionally, if you go into your reports and you go to research and diplomacy, you can actually check a graph of what every nation in the game spends on research. This is the beginning of the game, so there's not a lot of information here, but a blue bar will rise to show that nation spent this amount of MPPs on research. You can see this on yourself, your own nations. You can see this on enemy nations, even in a PvP. So this is valuable information to know where it is and to be checking. That is imperative to make sure you stay where you want to stay in terms to the research of your opponents, relatively. Now for what all of these things are. So let's start with the simplest stuff on the bottom right here. On the bottom right, and by the way, not every nation will have all the same research. There's very little variety to it right here that we see, just one right here, but not every nation has the same research, and I'll point that out now. But these 4 are the only 4 researches that are not directly tied into military action. So spying and intelligence here, this gives you a chance to just flat out spot units on the map that are outside of your line of sight. And this is kind of cumulative. The higher the level that you research this up to, the more chance, the more likelihood you'll spot more and more things. And it applies across an entire alliance. So the more majors you have with this, the better. This gives the allies a huge advantage in the information war, because they can have like 7 different majors rolling spying checks in one turn, whereas the Axis can only have 3. Additionally, every level of this will give you a bonus to research. So this is like also a research skill. If you raise it, you get a small bonus to research you are performing, and it will decrease the bonus of your enemies, meaning as well that the allies have a huge advantage in terms of research, because you could, as the Axis at all level 1, debuff your opponent's research by 3%, for example, up to 9%. Whereas as the allies, you could debuff the Axis at all level 1 by 7% or up to 21%. And that's crazy. Next, we have logistics. This one is also pretty multifunctional. So if you're ever going to put anything out to sea at a port, for example, put it out in a transport that looks like this, your logistics is what determines the amount of those that you can have in total. Different nations can also have different amounts. It also determines the costs of putting units out onto those transports, as well as the cost of operating them by train, or even with planes, operating them, not really by train, because they can go across continents with operation. It reduces those costs. So this is an incredibly important research for saving money in the long run. Production technology is a lot simpler by comparison. Every level of this will decrease unit costs by 5%. Doesn't matter what nation you are. If I go and I want to purchase a unit, well, see this right here? This is the price after production technology. This is the original price. This gets cheaper by 5% per level, as does any upgrading, as does any reinforcing. This is another invaluable tech for saving money in the long run, because imagine if I have to reinforce a H strength unit every turn. This is already with some tech behind me. It's 37 MPPs to get these 2 points back. Well, what if I got another 5% off of the original total, and another 5%, and another 5%, and start adding this up across different units across multiple turns? And this game does have a lot of turns. Industrial technology just flat out increases the amount of MPPs that your hexes produce. It is a way to abstract the process of, getting war bonds, turning economies into a war economy, using propaganda to get your population on board with the whole situation. It's all summed up in this one technology. So the higher this is, the more MPPs you will have available to you naturally without relying on convoys, plunder, or conquering. Now, we can shift over. Still on the right side, but top right is going to be the next simplest thing. Command and control is not that simple, but we'll start with that. This is a rating tech for your headquarters units. So every level of this you get, your headquarters, which have commanders. Let's go look at Japan for this real quick. Japan's a good way to see this. And you have different generals, and they have different ratings here. All these ratings will go up by 1 on every single leader, including the ones already here, and make them more effective with every level of research that you have. Additionally, it will increase their range for how they can support units. And it will increase the amount of units that they can support as well. And it can also increase their APs by only 0.5 per level, meaning when you max them out, they get 1 more AP to move around with. Not attack, because HQs, they can't attack, they can only move around. So it's useful in a multitude of ways, but it's very all-encompassing. Now, these warfare techs are, for the most part, very similar, but also dramatically different. And let's talk about how. So all of these warfare techs are the same in that they will increase passively. You see, you can only research 1 level. They passively increase the morale of every single kind of unit that they are talking about, with the exception of amphibious warfare. This one is just nothing like the ones above for some reason. We'll talk more about that. You can see it's researchable 5 times. But these all increase morale when you get them passively. You don't have to do anything else. Just infantry warfare. Okay, great. Infantry will have better morale. Armored warfare. Great. Armored units, better morale. Aerial warfare, air units. Naval warfare, naval units. But whereas that's all infantry warfare does, armored warfare also provides tanks, heavy tanks, mechanized units, generally armored units with an extra attack. So they get 2 attacks instead of 1. And they can even move in between those 2 attacks. Aerial warfare, this is much the same, but not entirely. It gives fighters the abilities to launch 2 intercepts or escorts, and for strategic bombers to be able to launch 2 strikes. It does not affect tactical bombers, medium bombers. Those do not get these bonuses from this. They only get morale. Naval warfare is simple like infantry warfare is, although it is important to note, I suppose, that something like a carrier, the airplanes on this don't benefit from aerial or naval entirely. It's half and half. So their morale bonuses come half from aerial warfare and half from naval warfare. And then the black sheep of the family, amphibious warfare. This one has everything to do with long-range amphibious transport. So not these guys, but say, for example, where do we have someone? These guys. And not just long-range either, just normal ones as well. But generally speaking, a amphibious transport does have an attack that it can use before it lands, whether it's long-range or not. That tech will actually buff this up. And it will also increase the amount of them that you can recruit, just like with logistics on normal transports. And in this case, there is a huge discrepancy between nations as well. Like Japan and America can have a ton of amphibious transports, especially long range, whereas someone like Germany can barely have any, even with the tech researched. Great, we've covered the right half. Now for the left half, which is, while they are generally more complicated than the ones on the right, I'd say they are also all very alike, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions. Starting from the top, infantry weapons is just a basic way to simulate the upgrading of infantry equipment throughout the war. If I were to right-click an infantry unit and upgrade it with infantry weapons, sometimes it might change in appearance. This main tech can change appearances for different kinds of units. But if I gave these guys an upgrade, you could see their stats improve in virtually every way, except for the ways that other techs exist for, like anti-air defense and mobility. Mobility is entirely for movement. And, you know, that's what anti-air is, right? Infantry weapons are for all those fighting stats for infantry. Anti-air, which is down here, is to defend against air. And mobility lets you move farther. Great, that's real simple. Some of these can be applied to locations as well. Like anti-air can be put on a fucking town to serve as a base defense. This is because it is normal to use strat bombers and the like to bomb towns and facilities to try to reduce someone's MPPs they're getting from it, or supply, for example. So, I mean, that's what those are. And then moving on to anti-tank weapons. This is just infantry weapons again, but for anti-tank units specifically, which is like a singular type of unit. Infantry weapons covers like every kind of soft infantry, including cavalry. And then anti-tank covers one unit. That's why it's cheaper. But it's also a risky thing to invest into because, you know, it's so not all-encompassing. Advanced tanks is the same thing as the above. It's infantry weapons for tanks and other heavily armored units. Advanced fighters, that's all of the above, but for fighter units. Heavy bombers, did you guess it? It's all of the above, but for strategic bombers specifically. But it costs a hell of a lot. Naval weaponry. Now this is infantry weapons replicated to a T. You can only research it twice, just like infantry weapons. This is literally infantry weapons, but for ships. This is where we start getting a little bit different. Long-range aircraft. It's one of those secondary stats. Whereas advanced fighters will make a fighter do more damage, long-range aircraft means that plane can fly farther. Not necessarily when moving, but for example, they have intercept and escort ranges. It will increase these ranges. And that's what this is. Advanced subs. This is literally infantry weapons, but for subs. It's also the only stats that subs get. And I guess there's a little bit more to this one because they can dive to escape an attack that would hit them. However, it's not as likely at the beginning, but with every level it improves. So at the start of the game, if you read down there at the bottom, they actually give you the exact percentage. It's 20%. And with every consecutive level, you get another 10%. So it can end up being 70% towards the end, which is great because a lot of sub-killing things become more common in the game, but subs don't get that crazy in comparison. They don't evolve as well. Artillery weapons. Can you guess what this is? That's right. It's infantry weapons for artillery. Rocket weapons. Now, this is very unique. Only Germany really has this, I think. Rockets are a unique type of unit that I think only Germany can buy. Right here. That is like artillery. If artillery was a strat bomber that could not be intercepted by literally anything. That's what this is. This is effectively a shorter range strat bomber that can, say, fire across the channel and draw supply and MPPs away by dealing strength point damage to locations, but they cannot be intercepted. Every level of research for it will increase the range and increase the damage done at respective ranges because there is a fall off for this kind of damage. Ground attack weapons are your infantry weapons for any kind of bomber that would specialize in attacking ground targets, such as tactical and medium bombers. Mobility, we talked about, it makes you go faster. AA, we talked about, and ASW, anti-submarine warfare. This is a way for destroyers to deal more damage, for example, to enemy submarines, but also for ships in general to defend against submarine attacks. This one's a little like all-purpose, but it's basically infantry weapons for counter submarine activities. That right there is the basics of what every single research in the game does. Now let's talk about what you should research as what nation. Now that's actually incredibly tough to kind of cover all at once because every nation needs vastly different things. You know, compare Germany, who's fighting almost entirely land wars with just one naval challenge to squash, maybe towards the end or the beginning, in which case the research would be unneeded for most of the game, to Italy, which doesn't even have enough MPPs to do much of any research, to Japan. Axis really has like the full spread, which is heavily reliant on naval things for its very survival, but also needs a healthy mixture of like land and air as well. So you're going to have to look at what nation, you're looking at. Look at your strategy, what you think you need. But here's some general recommendations. If you're expecting heavy land warfare, infantry weapons is a must. It's more of a must than any of these other ones that are clones of it as a default, because infantry are the cheapest and most common unit that you will be fighting with and against in the game. So high infantry weapons, which is only 2 levels, is a must. Rushing infantry weapons as soon as possible is pretty valid. It's pretty useful, especially as the Axis. It's maybe less important as the allies. You do need to catch up, but as the Axis is absolutely vital, pretty much for just about all of them. Anti-tank weapons, way more circumstantial in comparison. You only need to really research this at all if you plan on actually using anti-tank a lot, because, it's so not all covering. So a lot of nations could probably just completely ignore this. Germany and then maybe the Soviet Union after that are the only nations I'd suggest treating advanced tanks anywhere near as important as infantry weapons, because they can focus a lot on tanks. Now, you're still gonna be fighting primarily with infantry, so this is more important. But tanks can help you accomplish, like the Blitzkrieg, for example. They can help you do that breakthrough attack very well with, 2 attacks from armored warfare. And this makes armored warfare, honestly, more important than infantry warfare, because with good HQ and supply management, the bonuses from infantry warfare are way less consequential than the bonuses from getting an additional strike on tanks, mechanized units, and heavy tanks. That right there is highly important for the Eastern Front. Advanced fighters depends really how much you think you're going to need to be defending against enemy fighters. UK could benefit from this. Germany could benefit from this. The Soviets maybe. America could probably benefit from this, but not everybody is really a shoo-in for needing this. Like, does Italy need advanced fighters? Not really. Heavy bombers, this is another particular one. Strategically speaking, strategic bombers don't exactly get handed to you for free all the time. You have to want to go on a strategic bombing campaign to bother putting any points into this. Just like rocket weapons, these are pretty much the same. It's a way to destroy enemy MPPs without actually being able to, invade them directly, or maybe even alongside that. So treat those two the same. It's a strategy that you have to pursue, and nobody starts out with this strategy. So you'll know you need these if you decide to take those strategies. Naval weaponry is heavily important for America, the UK, and Japan, primarily. Other nations do have navies and can benefit from this, but it's not as all-encompassing as infantry weapons, despite being roughly the same in action. There are only so many nations that actually rely on their navies, and only so many that can sustain the costs of a navy in the long term and use it effectively. And those nations are the UK with their massive navy, America with their massive navy, and Japan, whose navy is what stops them from getting invaded. None of the other majors really rely very much on navy, and thus can probably ignore that. Long-range aircraft, you'll know if you need it. It's a good support thing for anyone that uses a lot of aircraft, Germany, for example. But it's not the most important thing. It's just, it makes your aircraft that little bit better. Ground attack weapons is way better. If you're fighting a lot of land targets, and let's say you don't have tanks to help do breakthroughs, and even if you do, having tactical bombers buffed up with ground attack weapons is invaluable for weakening enemies so you could push further. What you could do instead is have artillery weapons. There are far more limited uses to artillery in this game, but they do exist. It's another one of these strategies that you will have to pursue yourself, though. Artillery can work as a more defensive variant of a tactical bomber, but it can also be used on the offensive, albeit slower. It is a lot cheaper, though, and you only need to research it once to improve it. So one of these very, very useful for buffing land-based things. Advanced subs, well, Germany needs this, obviously. Any other nation's gonna need to go out of its way to pursue a submarine strategy. So again, you'll know if you need it. Mobility, I think basically every nation will eventually need mobility. It benefits everybody. If you have it, great. But it's kind of like a knight. It's like a medieval knight with all of his armor. Everyone on the battlefield would benefit from that, but almost nobody can afford this. Mobility is only a one-off research, so it doesn't seem as bad, but the prices to put mobility on units are absolutely insane. And thus you cannot feasibly hand it out to everybody. Maybe by the end of the war, you know, like 1947 in game. But generally speaking, this shit's expensive, and you're gonna have to really go out of your way to be able to afford this to begin with. Everyone should have access to it, but be particular with it. The Allies could probably benefit from this more in the long run, because the Allies have way more access to MPPs than the Axis. But it can be pretty handy for Japan when dealing with China. It would let you use less units to greater effect. And then for Germany, you know, it's invaluable for covering all of this massive space they have to cover. And then ASW, you know, who needs ASW? Who's going to be defending against subs? Primarily, that would be the Allies. The Axis don't really need ASW. The Allies can get submarines, so you might need it, and it's better to at least have it researching a little bit because of that, even as the Axis. But generally, as the Allies, you're really going to want this shit. Especially as the UK and America. India, maybe not so much, right? But, you know, context clues, right? Anti-air, well, everybody that's fighting Germany or the UK or Japan, or any of the more advanced majors is going to want some anti-air defense. The warfares, the one-offs, are generally all pretty useful to get no matter who you are. Naval and aerial and armor could be skippable, like one-offs, depending on what nation you're looking at. If a nation doesn't have any tanks or mechanized units, it doesn't need armored warfare. But you could get this stuff later, so you never know. Same thing with aerial and naval. Planes and ships are just so expensive. You might not really be going into any of that anyway. And so if you're not, then you don't need to invest into this research. But this research is so cheap and it's a one-off that doesn't hurt to get it most of the time. Infantry warfare, I would say this is another guaranteed everybody needs it sort of thing. Spying and intelligence? It's good to have, but everybody doesn't need it. The same goes with all of these, honestly. Because there's a couple nations that are exempt to having really important things like these, yet they still need infantry weapons in my eyes. An example of that is Italy. Italy and India. They earn, by default, like 100 MPPs a turn. That is not enough to do jack shit with. And yet they're majors somehow. Turkey joins the war and is probably worth more than them as a minor. Because then they just inherit all the research from somebody else and you get access to all their stuff. But Italy and India, for example, and heck, maybe even China, they earn so few MPPs that most of this research can be ignored regardless of their situation. Regardless. But infantry weapons is just a must for everybody. As is command and control after that, because if you have your own HQs as a major, you know, you're gonna really want this. And that's my strategic advice, as specific as I could make it without planning out your whole research sheet per nation, right? I hope this guide's been helpful to you. If you have any more ideas for guides I could do, feel free to leave those in the comments below. If you have any additional questions for me, feel free to leave those in the comments as well. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you on the next one.